They weren't in the movies. They weren't written about in magazines. But in the 1940s, in a city bursting with starlets and studio lights, there was another side of Los Angeles, one far from the camera's glow. Just blocks from the theaters and premieres, Skid Row became a last stop for the forgotten. And the women who lived there? They were among the most invisible. No headlines followed them. No protection came. What happened to them wasn't just tragedy. It was policy, poverty, and the silence of a city that didn't care. Skid Row, as we know it, had already taken form by the 1920s and 30s, anchored by Main Street and stretching east toward Alameda. It was where rail lines met cheap hotels, flop houses, pawn shops, and liquor stores. By the time the 1940s arrived, Skid Row had earned its reputation as the place where you ended up when you had nowhere else to go. While men filled the saloons and shelter lines, women's presence there was often met with suspicion or disregard. They weren't supposed to be there, but they were, in greater numbers than the city ever acknowledged. Most of these women weren't addicts or criminals. They were widows, displaced migrants, single mothers, or survivors of domestic violence. Some had fled abusive homes during the Depression. Others followed the promise of wartime jobs in LA's booming shipyards and factories, only to find those promises didn't apply to women without connections or white skin. When housing ran out, when paychecks stopped, when a husband or boyfriend disappeared, Skid Row became the only option left. For many, companion work became survival. It wasn't glamorized or even organized in the way Hollywood likes to imagine. There were no velvet couches or madams with fur coats. These women worked out of alleys, single-room hotels, or upstairs rooms of saloons. Their clients were often broke men themselves, veterans, drifters, or out-of-work laborers. The exchange was small. The risk was enormous. There was no real legal protection. In fact, LAPD officers were often part of the abuse. Some women were extorted by beat cops. Forced to pay bribes or offer themselves to avoid arrest. Others were arrested anyway and booked repeatedly for vague charges like vagrancy or lewd conduct. A few were sent to Sybil Brand Institute, the women's jail notorious for overcrowding and abuse. Once you were processed into the system as a Skid Row woman, getting out wasn't just about housing. It was about escaping a label that stuck like tar. In this landscape, missions became the only refuge. One of the few that accepted women in earnest was the Sunshine Mission, founded in 1941 by Essie Binkley West, a fiery, trumpet-wielding evangelist with a heart for the broken. She preached to the forgotten women on Skid Row, fed them hot meals and gave them beds, sometimes in exchange for a promise to sober up or hear the word. West had once been mentored by the infamous Amy Semple McPherson, and she brought that same theatrical energy to her street outreach. But even with her mission, shelter was limited and temporary. Beds ran out, funding dried up, and many of the women who came through West's doors slipped back into the streets when the sermons ended. Still, there were stories that didn't make the papers but left marks behind. Some women forged fragile communities. In the Indian Alley section of Skid Row, so named because of the concentration of displaced Native American women, unofficial watch groups formed. Elders would warn younger women about dangerous hotel managers or violent clients. Some shared food, clothes, or warnings. It wasn't enough to be called organized resistance, but in a place designed to erase them, these small acts were resistance in their own right. Then came World War II. At first it brought opportunities, defense plant jobs, warehouse work, and temporary economic relief. But as soldiers returned and wartime industries collapsed, many women were pushed out of jobs and housing to make room for returning men. Rents skyrocketed. Hotel owners stopped renting to women alone. The shelter system, already meager, had no infrastructure for supporting older women, women of color, or those with mental illness or addiction. What had felt like a fragile foothold for many was gone, and the number of unhoused women on Skid Row spiked again. The city's response wasn't compassion, it was containment. In the late 40s, Los Angeles officials, led by developers and politicians hungry for urban renewal, began a slow campaign to bulldoze large parts of Skid Row. Their stated goal was to clean up downtown. In practice, it meant targeting SROs, single-room occupancy, demolishing tenements, and pushing residents further east toward the rail lines and industrial blocks. Women who had stayed in those buildings for years were displaced overnight. Many ended up in alleys. Some simply vanished. Their stories weren't documented in mainstream papers. When they were mentioned at all, it was in cold, clinical tones: transients, vagrants, undesirables. There were no headlines like "Actress Dies Mysteriously" or "Starlet Found in Hotel Room." These women had no studio contracts, no publicists, no one calling the mayor's office for answers. But the truth is, they were as much a part of Los Angeles history as any actress or producer. Some of the very streets where they survived, San Pedro, Crocker, Fifth, and Main, are still Skid Row today, still filled with women whose stories mirror those from 80 years ago. And though the missions have changed, the root problems, housing insecurity, addiction, trauma, and systemic neglect, remain disturbingly familiar. The women of Skid Row in the 1940s weren't tragic footnotes. They were survivors in a city that pretended not to see them. And in some ways, it still doesn't.